everyone, a warm welcome back to The Doctor Will See You Now. How's your reading going? Have you got to the end of the last book that you were deep into? And are you looking for a new read? Well, if you like it scary, spooky, with the smell of the seaside thrown in, then my guest today and her latest book is just for you. Jen Williams, welcome to the consultation. How are you?
Hello, thank you. Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Yeah, it's lovely to be here.
It's great to have you with us. Again, I think 2023 for Dr. Noir is a year of getting to know some new authors, and I'm really enjoying, again, it's what I love about the genre, and it's all its different avenues, but that you get a chance to meet new authors and find out, about them and their work. So really grateful that you're on here and give us a chance. I know for one of the last authors that was on, one of the viewers actually wrote and said, I am loving these recommendations. So hopefully, Jen, being able to reach other readers, and that's great. So the book that we're gonna talk about you and your work and your writing, but we're also gonna, if we dare, delve into the pages of Games for Dead Girls. Now, before we started the recording, I did prime you and say, please, would you have a copy? So would you hold up the beauty now for us?
Yes, there we go.
Oh, and look at that
lovely hot pink font, which I love, and a bit of spot varnish.
It's gorgeous. Look at that. Yeah, gorgeous. I love how you I love how your cardigan sort of goes nicely with that.
Oh yeah, very
lovely coordinated. Yeah, and the stitching there.
Very creepy, isn't it? Yeah. When they showed me this cover, I think exactly the right reaction was that it's horrific, but also I love it.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, I mean, even before you get in the pages, I think whatever it's like, so what is that about, and what are those stitches? And so already, as a reader, it's like I want to get in and find out what this is all about. So I think that's great, visual temptation for getting us in.
An amazing cover. I love it. They did such a good job.
Yeah, HarperCollins, the publisher, and again, if anybody's watching in real time, came out at the end of March, so we're here sort of the beginning of April, so it's the buzz around it. Are you happy? Are you busy with all that's going on with it being released? Yeah,
it's just it's release week, or last week was release week, I suppose. I'm already losing track of time, which always happens when a book comes out. But we're launching it tomorrow at the little bookshop where I sometimes work. So I'm looking forward to that. We're gonna wet the baby's head.
Brilliant.
Sign a few copies and so on. So yeah, so it's been crazy busy, and I've been enjoying it. It's been really fun to see it go out into the world.
I think that's the thing, isn't it? I love the analogy that you used, about that celebration, wetting the baby's head. It is a birth, and seeing how that creation fares in the world.
Like after a year's worth of or over a year, I suppose, of writing and editing, and it being very much a thing that I've read 10 times. It's nice for it to be out with people who get to read it for the first time.
So just by way of detail, if for viewers and listeners that aren't familiar with you, so and this comes out, I think, in the way that you write, that Jen is a fan of grisly fairy tales from her youth. And she's gone on, of course, to write dark, unsettling thrillers with strong female leads. And this book does just that. And character-driven fantasy novels with plenty of adventure and magic. And your first thriller, Dog Rose Dirt, was published also by HarperCollins in July 2021. So if we could almost go back to the beginning, Jen, and find out what got you into writing, and what got you into writing, these crime thrillers. It's almost like this, we're going to dissect your work, but let's just start with the notion of crime thrillers, and we'll come to the supernatural. But so first of all, your beginnings and why the murky world of crime.
Well, I think probably like a lot of writers, writing was the first thing I wanted to do as a child. I loved stories, I loved being read to, I loved reading. So it seemed really natural to me that was what I wanted to do too. It was my favorite thing. So obviously I wanted to do that as well. And one of the first things I remember asking for Christmas was my own desk. Wow. So
nice.
Christmas or birthday. Yeah, so when I was about 5, I think, there's photos of my birthday party where I'm sitting at a new desk, with the stuff that a 5-year-old has on their desk. So, like glitter and sequins and things like that. But so it was definitely, I wanted a workspace. And then a few years later, I asked for a typewriter, and I started writing my own little stories and things. I think as a kid, I was always attracted to scary stories, even though I was a bit of a scaredy cat myself. I was very scared of things, but I think sometimes children almost, rather than being repelled by it, are attracted to the things that they know are going to keep them up all night. So as a kid, I really loved going to the library and trying to find those big books of the supernatural, or books of ghost stories, and even horror, books about horrible murders as well. As a child, I was endlessly attracted to. I always wanted to watch the films that I wasn't allowed to watch. I started getting out Stephen King books very early as well from the library.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but this is really funny that is a name that constantly appears in these conversations, and I wish I could meet him and say, thank you, because of you, that from you and your ideas have come so many amazing authors who are developing their ideas. So forgive me, carry on, sorry.
No, I completely agree. I have like a secret theory that like a decent percentage of people, certainly my age, who are writing books, and particularly scary books, all read Stephen King probably earlier than they should have. I went to the library, and luckily nobody really was monitoring what I was reading, but as a child, so I read whatever I liked. So I read a lot of Stephen King very early, a lot of other horror authors as well. And so I've always been attracted to darker stories, to weird stories as well. One of the things that one of the stories from when I was a kid that makes me laugh was my mum. This was again when I was about 5 or 6 years old. Bought a fairy tale collection off of a book club. Like the old-fashioned book clubs where you would order off of an order form or a magazine. And she bought it for me thinking it would be perfect for her 5-year-old. But when it arrived, what it was the complete Grimm's Brothers fairy tales, kind of in their original forms, which I don't know if you've ever read them.
They're grim. They're grim by name, grim by nature. Yeah.
They're not necessarily appropriate for a 5-year-old. But I absolutely loved them. I think Mum, she tried to put it away and was like, well, you can have it when you're older, but I sought it out and started reading them for myself. And I think that again is was almost a foundational text, because it's full of really weird unsettling things, and a lot of horrible a lot of horrible murder, a lot of horrible abuse, and some really sort of dark places. And I just loved it. So I guess those were my early inspirations, and I kind of went through school still really loving writing. I started writing a lot of short horror stories and things like that, but I kind of while I was at school, I was advised that writing is not really a career for Well, I mean, I went to your sort of standard comprehensive school from a very working class family background, etc. And it's not presented as a career that you can have.
Yeah.
So I kind of put it on the back burner for a while. And I ended up going to art college instead, which again is not really a career that you're told you can have as a working class person, but I decided to do it anyway. And it was only when I finished art college that I kind of came back to writing quite seriously, because I realized that it was my first love, and I wasn't happy when I wasn't doing it. So
yeah. Can I ask, the art that you produced at that time, and I don't know whether you still produce art, but is that as deliciously sinister as you're writing it?
A lot of it was, yeah. A lot of it was. I kind of I did an illustration degree at art college, and what I ended up kind of specializing in was, funny enough, was children's picture books. And again, I guess this is probably the fairy tale stuff, the influence of that. But they were always quite dark picture books. And at the time, I used to have a lot of arguments with my art tutors about it, because they would say, you can't write this, you can't draw and write this stuff for children because it's too scary, or it's too unsettling, it's too weird. And I always completely disagreed, because it was exactly the sort of thing that I loved when I was a kid, and I think a lot of kids do, and I feel like I've been validated, because since that time at college, I've seen a lot of picture books that have gone a lot darker, and a lot creepier and more interesting. So they were totally wrong and I was totally right, is what I take away from that.
Vindicated. Yes. Yes, definitely. Now, so as you mentioned, in this genre, this is the second book, first being Dog Rose Dirt, so it's a little bit like book 2 syndrome. But I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about the different experience, or maybe it was exactly the same experience in creating these two stories. How was it, book 1 and book 2? How's it been?
Well, it's interesting that you ask about that, because I've had kind of book 2 syndrome before, because I've written fantasy trilogies, and my second fantasy book, which was called The Iron Ghost, was really difficult. I really struggled with it. And I think I scrapped the first 60,000 words at least twice. Yeah. So, like a whole book's worth of words I chucked away writing that book, because I just couldn't get my head in it, and I was terrified of what people were going to think. And then you kind of sort of fast forward to Dog Rose Dirt, which was a completely new genre for me to write, although I read a lot of crime and thrillers and horror. It was completely new to me, the construct of those books and how they work. So it was hard. It was a hard process and a steep learning curve writing Dog Rose Dirt. And I was lucky enough that I had a lot of advice and assistance from both my editor, Natasha Barden, Harper, and my agent, Juliet Mushins, who's a very editorial agent. So she knows commercial fiction back to front. So they were both really helpful.
Great.
And I got through it, and I feel like I learned tons, and it was really interesting. And then for Games for Dead Girls, actually was a much more fun experience, which is unusual.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
Because I think with Games for Dead Girls, I was keen to draw on a lot of my own background for it. So a lot of the book is set in a small seaside town, which is very heavily based on the town where we used to spend all of our family holidays. And I think that being able to draw on that was really satisfying, and kind of it was so fun to go back to those memories and to try and convey that to a reader, sort of bring them into the world of my memories from when I was a child. It sounds quite self-indulgent when I say it out loud, but when I was there, when I was experiencing those things, I always felt like it was a good location for a scary story, you know, and there's something about seaside towns, especially out of season, that I think, you know, can be really creepy and unsettling, and I love that.
So definitely, you know, just to say the idea of, you know, those spaces when it's not at the height of the season, it's almost like the ghosts seem to roam at will.
Because everything is so quiet, you know, and it feels like everything's been packed away for the year, but obviously there's still some life there. It's just, you know, really interesting. And so I had like a high old time writing a lot of Games for Dead Girls, and it's also the first time I've written in a novel first person point of view character, which I also really enjoyed, you know, because Charlie, the main character, has an interesting voice, and it was really fun to sort of channel her for a while, because I love a lot of first person point of view novels, but I think they're difficult to write well, so I've always been a bit nervy about it, so, you know, getting to do that finally was fun.
I wonder, because you've set it in a place that whilst the location you know, it has in the book, it has a fictitious name, but setting it in a space that you were very familiar with, I wonder, did that help write the first person?
Yeah, I'm sure it did, you know, and I feel like probably unconsciously that's almost probably why it ended up being first person, because I knew it so well that it made sense to write it, you know, as if the character's speaking to you, you know, it's very familiar.
I am. It's lovely to hear an author say that writing book 2 was a delight and a pleasure, and also that you've had that different experience, you know, between the fantasy novels that you've written, where that you did have a bit of a hassle there, but this, you know, Games for Dead Girls has allowed you a very different experience with the second book. Just to think about the structure, you weave the story through 3 time periods. So we've got now. I love how it's called now. So when is that now? That's great. It's now, and that's all that matters. You've got the late 1980s, and then there's, you know, like post-war Britain between the late 40s and early 60s. And I'd like to talk a little bit later in more detail about the choice, especially of that strand, because that, you know, I almost want to say, you know, I wish you'd written more about that. I was that, you know, just the, you know, the amount of time, and but seriously, not because it works beautifully what you've done, but that really drew me in. But if you could maybe explain, and sometimes it just happens, but did you consciously choose these time periods, and if so, why?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that I've found about writing sort of crime thrillers with a sort of heavy horror kind of undertone is that often they're about the past encroaching on the present, and often thrillers are about, you know, secrets and things that have been covered up, and the book is the process of uncovering those secrets, you know. So it makes sense to have, you know, 2 different time periods. I know like a lot of thrillers will start where the prologue is in the past, and then you come into the, you know, and it gives you an idea of what might be hidden, and then you come into the present, and it's a case of uncovering what's happened before. So I feel like it's almost natural to have, you know, a past and a present timeline in these kinds of books. But in terms of consciously picking the late 1980s, that was kind of an obvious choice for me, because that would have been when I was having these similar experiences to Charlie, going to the seaside with my family, staying in a caravan. usually a caravan that sleeps 6 people, and there were 12 of us. You know?
I giggled at that point because it reminded me, I mean, albeit this happened further north, but during my childhood, my nana's sister had 5 kids, and I used to go with my, and it's like, this, and piling all these people in, and how did we do it? I mean, I'm sure health and safety nowadays would come around and say, this can't happen. Yeah,
you do, that you just can't get away with it now. But
yeah,
and in fact, what the situation in Games for Dead Girls with Charlie's family and the caravan is actually much less people than I had in our caravan. I had more aunties and a lot more cousins, all crammed into the place. And some of my fondest memories are those holidays, because we had such a good time. But I mean, you say now, like, how did we do it? I mean, my brother was literally sleeping on the blow up lilo, that you would have sort of inflatable bed thing for the sea. We would bring that in and he would sleep on it because we didn't have enough beds. So a lot of, because that storyline is sort of heavily drawing from my own childhood, it made sense to set it around about the same time. I think probably Charlie's a bit older than me, a couple of years older than I would have been. So but it made sense. It was a period that I was familiar with, so I remember well, have a lot of nostalgia for, obviously. So it made sense for the sort of the 1980s strand, and also because in thrillers you're always talking about what's happened in the past, basically, and how it's impacting the present.
And then you also, as we said, you also take us much further back into the past, and so again, that those revelations of Derek's story, and where did Derek come from?
Where? It's a good question. Derek was one of those characters that I think he evolved over several drafts. Interesting. So the first draft, he wasn't in it that much, and it was as I was doing the second draft, I realized that we needed to know more about him and where he came from and what happened, without giving too much away. And that was when I decided on the idea of having this other timeline that kind of skips forward a lot. So you start in just after the Second World War, and then it comes gradually closer. I guess it goes up to the 60s, 70s. And one of the reasons for it is that I quite like when a book completely throws you for a loop.
Yes.
You're suddenly reading something and think, what is this about? I thought I had a handle on this, and now we're being told this story that feels unrelated. And I love that, because I feel like there's a suspense about it, because you're waiting to find out how this is involved in the main storyline.
And I loved the fact, though, that I mean, so we have characters and their stories, but I think you also give us that window on the society of a certain time, and we should also think, because of course we have the folklore as well, which goes further back in time. But I think with each of those elements, you open the window for us on society at that time and attitudes towards certain things, and that is so. I found it just so engaging. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It was really interesting to write his timeline, actually, because, as you said, it takes in quite a chunk of time, a lot of changing attitudes, a lot of changing times for people. The end of the Second World War is very different to the middle of the 60s, and and again, that's very different to the time that sort of younger Charlie's timeline in the 80s is again very different. So it's really fun. I mean, one of the things when you write a book like that, one of the fun things about it is being able to challenge yourself with, can you write a scene that's set in the 1940s, and then a couple of chapters later write a scene that's set in like 1962, which is really fun. And
I think that comes across for as sinister as as the Strands are. There's this underlying of an author's delight in creating the story. So
that comes across.
So telling scary stories, and you talked about how in childhood and youth you enjoyed that, and here we have again young protagonists enjoying telling scary stories, and one of those is around a character from folklore called Stitch-Faced Sue.
Yes.
And I wondered, is Stitch-Faced Sue, does she really form part of the folklore of the South Coast, or is Stitch-Faced Sue part of your grisly imagination?
Unfortunately, she comes entirely from my imagination. But she has a lot of different DNA in her, I would say. So,
okay, can you share?
So I think probably the key thing was, so the place where Charlie goes to in the book is called Hythe, and it's a fictional seaside town, but there's a real seaside town called Dymchurch, which is on the southeast coast. It's sort of near Folkestone and Hythe, and that's where we went on our holidays pretty much every year. And Dymchurch has a really fun piece of folklore of its own, about a smuggler called Dr. Sin. And he supposedly he was I think he was he might have been a priest, but in his at night he would become Dr. Sin, and he would do all these kind of smuggling activities. There's a lot of smuggling history on the South Coast, etc. And they used to have Dr. Sin Day in Dymchurch every other year, I think, and they probably still do. And on that day, you would have a guy dressed up, riding a horse, and he would come through the town, and there was various activities. But he used to wear this terrifying costume because he was dressed like a kind of scarecrow.
Yeah.
With this sort of weird pale bag face, and he used to wear a big black cloak, and I was terrified of it as a child. Whenever we were there and it happened, I would be I would hide. I would be really scared of it. But at the same time, again, there was that fascination with a thing that scares me. So very much Dr. Sin would be at the heart of the idea of Stitch-Faced Sue, this kind of because Stitch-Faced Sue is kind of developed from a supposedly real piece of folklore from the area. But also, I think I've always been interested in urban legends and the sort of weird, scary stories that people pass on as if they're true. So I grew up loving all of those stories, like the sort of stories where a woman she's receiving all these scary phone calls, and she tells the police, and the police stay indoors, don't go outside. There's obviously some sort of maniac on the loose, and then it turns out, of course, that the phone calls are coming from inside the house, that kind of story. Or the hook in the car door, and all of those things I absolutely loved when I was a kid. And that's all very much kind of in Games for Dead Girls, and Charlie's love of all of that is definitely my love of that. And it's interesting that it still goes on, that you still have a kind of modern urban folklore now, and particularly online.
Yes.
And the other big inspiration for Stitch-Faced Sue was Slender Man. I don't know if you've heard of that at all.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's a weird story. So years ago, there was a competition online where people were asked to kind of make up a scary urban legend or folklore, piece of folklore. And somebody came up with this idea of the Slender Man. Gosh, I can't remember the chap's name. It was Eric Knudsen, maybe. And he came up with this idea of this just really scary figure that abducts children. And he sort of created a graphic, or like a manipulated photo of the Slender Man. And it kind of took off in a really really unusual way, in that people started making up more stories about Slender Man as if it were true.
Yeah.
And it got a life of its own. It became really popular. I think there's a film now, there's a video game, all of this stuff based on, this idea that somebody had on the internet. And interestingly, a few years ago, there was a really horrifying case in America where a couple of teenage girls became very obsessed with Slender Man, and actually went as far as to attack another another girl, who thankfully I think survived, and she was okay. But I just found that so interesting, that this entirely made up thing ended up having a life of its own that had real world consequences, which is a big theme in Games for Dead Girls. So yeah, it's definitely a combination of a kind of a thing that scared me when I was a kid, Dr. Sin. It's a combination of urban legend and folklore, and how they can have their own lives, and how that can sometimes end up having unforeseen consequences.
I am so grateful that you've explained this to us. This is so good, because going back now and thinking about how that character is talked about, so thinking of your process in the influences and what led you to create Stitch Face Sue. It's brilliant. I mean, it then leads me to ask you, because I think we give nothing away by saying that scissors do figure in the book. I think that's fine. We can say that because they crop up in various places, so that's fine. Even scissors, is that because I wondered about working out fears and phobias. Do scissors make you a bit queasy?
Well, not as such, but I think they have. I think they're really interesting objects, because they have, because they're objects that we all have. They're in our houses, we use them every day. But I think there's something a tiny bit sinister about them that I quite like. I remember, because my nan used to do a lot of knitting. She's your classic nan, did loads of, all that sort of stuff. And she had a big sewing box, and I remember her scissors in that box seemed huge to me as a child, because proper big sewing scissors were about this long. And there was just something a little bit unnerving about them, and I think they tie really well into the idea of fairy tales, because in fairy tales it's often about households and homes and normal families, and these are the things that you have to hand.
And that duality of an everyday item that suddenly takes on this menace.
It's all about everyday things suddenly appearing in places where they shouldn't be, and them having unsettling connotations because of it.
And it's got nothing to do with the fact that sometimes I think I'm losing it, where things appear in places where they shouldn't be. No. So thinking about, again, your ability to create characters, but then right from that preteen and teenage perspective, as well as the adult perspective. So if we take the dynamic between Charlie and her niece, let me see, and I wonder, and then of course with the younger Charlie, do you have a preference for writing adult or younger, experiences and expressions?
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Because I don't write a lot of, or I haven't written a lot of sort of child characters really. But I did enjoy writing sort of young Charlie, interacting with the friends that she makes at the caravan park and her cousins, you know, and it's a dynamic that I remember really well. You know, I remember being, you know, the second youngest of 9 grandchildren, you know, and the sort of the dynamic of that, you know, of being being the one that maybe people don't want around so much because you're too little,
yeah.
You know, or being the one that gets, you know, under the feet of all the adults all the time, or the one that sort of scarpers off around the campsite. I remember all that really well, so it was fun to kind of channel that into young Charlie. And it's funny because I was talking to a friend about, because she just read the book herself, and she was like, I can really see you in this book, you know, you are both sort of young Charlie, and Charlie has a younger cousin called Jenny, who I very deliberately named after myself, because Jenny is the kind of My Little Pony obsessed, kind of wet drip of a
and speak about her I think it's a cardigan sleeve just being stuffed with tissues. Yeah,
and that was just, you know, that was very, not, you know, not entirely me, but very, you know, there's a big percentage of me as a child in that as well. So I really enjoyed writing the sort of child view of things, you know, and I perhaps that doesn't reflect particularly well on me, but I still feel like I remember what it's like to be a kid.
I think it does. I think it really does reflect well, because I think, you know, capturing those credible voices in the and one of the aspects that I really enjoyed was the sense of, you know, despite innocence and lack of experience, but there felt like there was a wisdom around, you know, young Charlie. Yeah, I don't know, and then her niece, you know, just that typical disgruntled, you know, very much, oh, come on, really. and Charlie doing her best, you know, older Charlie doing her best to try and interact.
I think because one of the things that bothers me when I read books is when children are written badly, you know, or in a kind of one note kind of way, and I think it's more complicated than that, you know. They're more interesting and more difficult, I think, probably. So I tried really hard to have kids that felt different to each other, and also, you know, like there's some depth to them maybe, and, you know, they are complicated and they're just as formed by their experiences as adults are. And I think older Charlie dealing with her niece as well was was probably, again, I don't have kids, I do have nieces, you know, so I'm used to being, I guess, the cool auntie is what they would call it now, you know. And I know what it's like to, you know, dealing with younger kids when they're just on the sort of verge of becoming teenagers, and they kind of don't have time for your nonsense anymore. So writing, you know, Charlie doing her best, but because of Charlie's circumstances and her own upbringing, she's not great, you know, she doesn't have a lot of that kind of life experience. So so it was interesting to write the relationship between her and her niece, because it's not a relationship you see very often, I don't think.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that relationship is, I think, is very present in life, but do we see it on the page? So it's nice to see that come onto the page.
Because I guess, you know, most often you're talking about mums and daughters, or mothers and children, but that relationship, which, like you said, it exists everywhere, but you don't see it in fiction as much, which is this one.
Yeah. I got a couple more questions. I am aware of the time, and I know, like we've said at the beginning, there's all sorts going on, so I don't want to. Yeah. I don't want to detain you too much longer. But am I right? And did you determine to do this? I don't know, but there seems to be a repeat theme through the book of parents who don't do right by their children, or the aspect of neglect, of not being protected, and and I want to be careful in what I say about that, because I know things happen to children, sadly, that is of no fault of parents.
Yeah.
But there did seem to be that sense there of certain things wouldn't have happened to either fictional characters or the characters in the book if parents had been more careful, doing a better job. I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's interesting because I think all of those elements were there, in the first draft, but it was only in later drafts where I kind of realized that it was a theme, so it was obviously came out unconsciously, I guess. But it's one of those things, once you've picked up on a theme like that, you can go back in your future drafts and bring it out more, so yeah, it's definitely a repeating pattern in the book, I would say. And it is something that interests me, because I was talking to a friend about this recently, actually, that I think people of my age group, kind of, I guess, the sort of tail end of Generation X and kind of elder millennials, we had quite a different upbringing, I think, to certainly what kids have today, where you're a lot more monitored.
Yeah.
Now.
Yeah.
Whereas, when I was little, we weren't particularly watched or monitored. As I said briefly earlier about getting books out of the library, no one was checking what I was reading. Nobody really cared, and that's fine. I actually think that's a good thing. I think you should let kids read whatever they want. But that also, nobody was watching what I was consuming on TV, or we were left to run around outside by ourselves,
with no possibility of the mobile phone contact even. No. Where are you, what's going on? I just think off you go out into the world and whatever might happen.
Yeah, which it feels wild to talk about it now, to say, when I was 5 or 6 years old, I would go and play out in the front, we lived in like a cul-de-sac when I was small, and I would just go off by myself. Yep. And I had a little trike and I would ride it around, or I would go off with other kids that lived up the road and we'd wander about, which seems wild now, because as you said, there was no way of contacting us if we disappeared. No one was monitoring what we were up to, and it's such a contrast to how kids live now. And whether that's a good or bad change, I think it's complicated. I think.
Yeah, definitely. What does it say? What does it say about society in general? Are we, have we progressed because we do care?
Yeah.
Is it that we are now willing to call out certain behaviors and crimes that before we weren't willing to call out or couldn't call out, or have we lost certain freedoms, or have our children lost certain freedoms that we thoroughly enjoyed?
Yeah, it's complicated, isn't it? I think there's good on bad on all sides, and I'm not sure that I can unpick it all, really. I think you're right in that there were certainly bad things happening at that time and before that time. But I think we know more about it now. We're certainly hyper aware of the news and what's happening at all times. So it's obviously harder for parents to put that from their minds, I think. And,
Definitely. Yeah.
Because as rare as those as terrible things happening to children in that sense are, you know, we are hyper aware of them now, in a way that we weren't, I don't think, back then. And we often wind my mum up by saying, you know, oh, you know, we just left in the streets to go.
You were a bad mom.
Yeah, and it's not true at all. You know, obviously, our parents loved us dearly and cared a lot, you know, but it was their childhood was even more different. You know, they were even less monitored, and you know, I know my mum and her brothers and sisters spent a lot of time sort of in the woods. There were woods near where they lived, and they spent all their time over there, you know. So yeah, I guess the idea of, I think it's like a benign neglect that would be a way of talking about that sort of thing. But it's also in the book, it brushes up against less benign neglect.
Yes, I was going to say, even poor Stitch Face Sue. That's not benign neglect, but we'll leave that for readers to enjoy that aspect of neglect. Jen, I think I've got one more question for you, and it's one that I love to ask because it gets us right into what this book means to you. And I'd just like to ask the part or the aspect that when you look at it, that you are proudest of, you know, that I created this. What would that be about the book?
Oh, blimey. Wow. That is a big, that's a big question. I think the thing that I'm proudest of in that book, or the thing that I enjoy, is almost a thing I can't talk about, because there's a central surprise, I guess, in the book.
That's great. We can just say that you know, when readers or listeners get in and they find out about that central, that you know, that thing that happens.
It's a turning point, I guess, in the book.
Yes.
That I really enjoyed writing, for lots of reasons. And again, it's you can't really talk about it without spoiling things, but that gave me a lot of joy, the lead up to it. All the different little clues and hiding things, all of the little things you have to do writing a thriller. I really enjoyed it, and so that's probably the thing that I'm proudest of in the book.
It's great, thank you, and thank you for the way that you so carefully did that. We have to get in there to find out what it actually is. It's great. Jen, an utter delight to spend time together. Thank you so much for your time and for lovely. You know, explaining, you know, this. Well, I don't want to. It is beautiful, but it's creepy. It's great. The creepiness is wonderful. Games for Dead Girls. All the very best with it. I hope you and I get a chance at some other point to have some more conversation about your writing.
Absolutely. Always happy to come back.
Brilliant. Jen, thank you so much. See you soon, yeah?
Thank you.
Okay, bye.